Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. This afternoon's webinar is Smoked Yankees, Wild Catholics and the Newspaper Lions of Manila, The Multiplicity of Race in the Philippine-American War by Dr. Brian Shott. Before I proceed, I just need to state that the opinions expressed during the webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is the author of Mediating America, Black and Irish Press and the Struggle for Citizenship, 1870 to 1914. He received his PhD in history from the University of California at Santa Cruz. His dissertation received an honorable mention in the 2016 Margaret A. Blanchard Prize, given annually by the American Journalism Historians Association. He has taught U.S. history to inmates and served as a writing tutor through the Prison University Project of San Quentin, California. His journalistic writing can be found in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. He is a visiting researcher of the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. So, ladies and gentlemen, without much further ado, I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Shott.
Hi, thank you so much, Fernando, Fernie. And I also wanted to thank Dinah Roma. And I don't know if Farish is here, Farish from NTU in Singapore, but the three of them are very helpful in setting this up and just have been very, very welcoming. I'm on my way back to the US from Singapore with a stopover in Manila, where my wife grew up. So I guess I thought, I don't give myself that many compliments, but I will say I'm a decent writer. A writer without a script, though, I'm not so good. And I had a little, tried to put together 20 or 30 minutes a little bit differently and wound up trying to do things a little off the cuff. But I did wind up finding some photographs that I thought we could look at. Most people are most interested when I've talked on similar topics. People are very fascinated by African-American soldiers in the Philippine-American War. And it is a fascinating topic. If we don't get to the wild Catholics and the Lions of Manila, or if you want to hear about that, please let me know. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, and I'll try to end soon enough so that we can begin. So why don't we go to just some photographs. I've done some work on T. Thomas Fortune, who was a very, at the time was a famous Black journalist who went to the Philippines shortly after the Philippine-American War. So let me share my screen and go to, oops. Okay. Okay. So that's T. Thomas Fortune. And already several things jump out. So this is from 1903. He's actually, the cholera, I believe, is raging. There's a lot of diseases after the Philippine-American War, the warfare and the brutality of the war, the policies of US troops towards concentrating people together in camps and that sort of thing. So it's whether it's a foolish or a brave trip, T. Thomas Fortune is an agent of I believe of the US Treasury. He gets a temporary appointment to study trade in the Philippines from Roosevelt. there's a slight chance that he's trying to tweak Roosevelt a little bit here. He looks like he might be dressed deliberately like one of the Rough Riders. I think it's unlikely. I think he's probably just feeling like this is how you dress when you are an intrepid explorer. But he's really at odds with Roosevelt at this point. And that's largely because Roosevelt had said complimentary things about Black troops in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. Philippine-American War and Spanish-American War sometimes collapsed together, sometimes not. But then Roosevelt just sort of did a flip-flop and said, actually, the Black troops did not fight well, and Fortune is just was livid about that. What interests me about this, I guess I should pause a little bit and say, and talk about kind of my book and the dissertation before that, just really briefly. I'm interested in how, I wanted to get at how newspapers sort of mediate a lot of these civil rights struggles. I looked at Irish American and African American sort of so-called race men and some women, just sort of activist editors who were at the helm of their own newspapers as they were, and newspaper weeklies, so not dailies. But the weeklies had a lot of power even in the early 19th century, early 20th century and late 19th century. I'm trying to get at how the newspaper itself may have affected their thinking. I think when I started, I thought I would, so I'm older, but I started my, I went back to school, got my PhD just in 2015. So I had a career in journalism and internet companies a little bit, a lot of other odd jobs. So I didn't really know what kind of scholar I was going to be, and I thought that I would figure out, almost in a Marshall McLuhan sort of the medium is the message, have something really important to say about how newspapers change the message. And that's just really hard to get at it. As it turns out, as a scholar, and I thought I would be bored at diving into the archives. And instead, it's sort of the opposite. I'm a little weak in theory, and often get head first in newspaper archives and just read newspapers all day long. So I am interested in the kind of the materiality of the press, including photography, and how would newspapers affect, say, Black activism in this time period, and be at odds with it? One obvious way, I think many people have kind of noticed, is if the editor is advocating for Black pride, but you're running Black skin lightening products or hair straightening products on the side, maybe this is a way in which the message is getting changed by the medium itself. Another way might be the competition with other editor activists, and maybe the need to have your own take on what should happen, what the solution to, say, the so-called Negro problem is, or all the different debates that African Americans are having about how accommodation is to be, how protest versus Black-owned businesses. Having your newspaper look unique may drive some editor activists to actually shape their thinking in a certain way that might lead to distinguishing themselves from their competitors. Photography itself, in this case, I feel like Fortune is, he's away from his newspaper at this time, on this journey to Hawaii and then the Philippines. But he's using the tools of journalism, photography, to try to present himself, I think, as part in some ways of the American project in the Philippines, but also critiquing it. You could even look closely. This is, I think you can see my pointer on my screen, but he's standing in front of a backdrop. And these you can find in like Sears Roebuck catalogs at the time. You can find these backdrops, and I found one that looked, very close to this. Here's another picture. I think they are also in front of a backdrop. This is Fortune, Captain Wormsley, and Captain Woods. We'll return to Captain Woods in a little bit. And he takes pictures. This is when he came back, he published about his travels in the Philippines in The Voice of the Negro, which is a Black edited sort of journal. And he does take photos in this kind of anthropological sort of way. It's very similar to, say, how white travelers in the Philippines would, with occasional twists. He will say, picture taken by a Filipino, or sometimes if I had more photos to show you, or it was a different presentation, we could sort of look at that. Let me, and these are just some of the mastheads of the some black newspapers that I looked at in the Philippines. Let me exit out of this and stop sharing where I want to be. You can't see what I'm looking at. I know there are many of you out there, 66 it says, but it's strange to not hear you, but thank you for keeping your photograph on keeping your microphone on mute. So that's just sort of an intro of Black troops in the Philippines. The Black press was split on whether to even fight in the Philippines. And this is going to, these tensions are going to continue. And I guess the chapter in the book that I'm mostly speaking about now, we'll talk about the book at the end of the presentation here, is I guess it's stressing the fractures in U.S. power. Fortune says if the American flag is to fly in the Philippines, African Americans are going to have to be drafted to hold it up. There were only about 6,000 Black troops in the Philippines. I think US troops all total were about 125,000. But they did make a big difference, and they all wrote home. Many wrote home, or wrote letters to the Black press. The big book here is called Smoked Yankees. Smoked Yankees was the term probably given by either the Spanish and or Filipinos to these Black US troops. They used the Black press to talk about Filipinos, to talk about their experience in Manila. There's a book, Smoked Yankees, published many decades ago that has a lot of this information. And you get, and I think there was a hint of this in both Fortune's photo and those mastheads that I just showed. African Americans are in this funny position where they are making, seeing a kind of racial affinity with Filipinos as at least non-white people, and also as a people under duress, under oppression from the US. And so some of these letters home are indistinguishable from what's being written by most white soldiers, pride in serving, maybe cynicism about Filipinos, maybe even a racialized sort of discourse of civilization, Filipinos as more primitive, perhaps. And other letters are very different. talking about possible solidarities between Filipinos, the racism experienced by Black troops from white troops and white Americans in Manila after the war. And so you have this split and sort of everything in between. The other, and I could sort of give you a quote from, I wanted to quote from the Richmond Planet. I'll go ahead and share the screen for this, sorry. Back and forth, share the screen. You know, the Richmond Planet is a Black newspaper in Richmond, Virginia. It says, a man who is not good enough to vote for a government is not good enough to fight for it. So it took a strong sort of, don't go to Cuba, don't go to the Philippines to fight. Where our own battle is here, you know, long before, and you know, the second quote, England has sent Black men. This is talking about the Boer War as far as, or the South African War, as well as the Philippine War. England has sent Black men to fight for white men's rights in South Africa. Got to move myself here. And the United States has sent Black men to take away Black men's rights in the Philippine Islands. In both cases, the Blacks get the worst end of the job. Here, sort of, we've collapsed African Americans and Filipinos. There is a real tension in of course, on how Americans are literally drawing sometimes in their cartoons and thinking about racial difference in the Philippines. But, you know, long before Muhammad Ali is talking about the Viet Cong never yelling racial epithets at him, we have the same sort of sentiment. On the other hand, the last quote here is an even bigger Black paper than the Richmond Planet. And here I paraphrased a little bit, but Filipinos, the editor says, we're possessed with much pride and independence of spirit, have some notions of government, but, quote, the Bushmen of today cannot be the legislator of tomorrow. The utmost our country could consistently do would be to give them the best form of government possible under the circumstances. And when they can maintain that, then the staying hand of America might be withdrawn. So, you can't understand the African-American view and this split view of the Philippines, I don't believe, without understanding the colonization struggle. The Black press at this time is, most of it is against Bishop Turner, African-American bishop who wants to voluntarily have African-Americans return to Africa. And in arguing against that, this racialized kind of discourse of civilized and savage comes up with respect to Africa. And they're sort of repeating that with respect to the Philippines. But these racial solidarities or affinities, anyway, are real. I'm sure many of you know that there were Black troops that defected. Fagan, either Donald or David, I think Donald Fagan, maybe David Fagan, was the most famous, writing taunting letters of African-American who defected to the Philippine freedom fighters, patriots, rebels, insurgents by US Army notion or terminology. And Fagan wrote taunting letters to General Funston. So there was that tension. And as I'm sure maybe some of you know, Filipino rebels picked up on this. And in fact, produced propaganda looking at the US situation. so they're well aware of this sort of tricky position that African-American soldiers are in. And they direct some propaganda their way in the form of flyers. This is, in America at this time, has been called the nadir of Black history, the low point. And that may seem a little bit funny. Why wouldn't slavery be the low point? But maybe it's where you think you're going, or not where you're at. A lot of optimism post-emancipation had been crushed by this point because of all the lynchings that's going on, and the end of Reconstruction when U.S. troops leave the South, and it seems like the government has abandoned that project for African-American full citizenship rights. Filipino rebels are well aware of lynching, and around this time, I believe 1899, Sam Hose, also known as Sam Holt, is lynched in Atlanta. And this is, all lynchings are brutal, but this is a particularly bad one where souvenirs of his body were sold, photographs, and this sort of thing. And Filipinos produced these propaganda flyers saying, urging Black soldiers to, quote, consider your history, and, quote, take charge that the blood of Sam Hose proclaims vengeance, and defect. Ultimately, there were not that many defections. And in fact, the work of the Filipina scholar, Cynthia, I may mess up the last name, Marasagan, I think. I may be mispronouncing that because I don't remember the spelling offhand. Has done a lot of work on Black soldiers, deeper archival work than me, as I've been focused a little more on newspapers. And those affinities between Filipino soldiers and African-American soldiers can sometimes be turned against any sort of liberation project. That is, the US military, she finds, may have been able to use Black soldiers to pacify towns because they were able to do so a little less violently. I can't remember whether she says that Black soldiers were sometimes used as spies or not, but those affinities can be tricky because then the occupier can use them. So that's just a little example of some of the tensions in the U.S. that come with the U.S. A very heterogeneous country. When it goes abroad, empire can have those tensions within it. What are we at here? 323. I guess I'll go sort of quickly over what some of the who the wild Catholics are and who the newspaper lions of Manila are. The newspaper lions are the military press. There are, if there are editor activists in the U.S. From these Black and ethnic minority groups, there are soldier editors in Manila. There's the Manila Freedom and the Manila American, and a few other papers at this time. And you read some of the memoirs from, or at least personal writing from some of these editor soldiers. And during the war, sometimes they were literally stopping what they were doing if Manila was being attacked and rushing out and joining the regular troops again. But after the war, it seems like they mostly wanted to be making profits through vendor ads in their papers. And even more so than US soldier diaries, which sometimes are quite racist and other times towards Filipinos and other times quite complimentary. It runs the whole gamut. And I would recommend if any scholar that goes with one way or the other is just revealing, more about his or her politics than what's in the archive. There's everything from begrudging respect or admiration of Filipinos in soldier diaries and accounts, and just sheer pathological or murderous racism, and everything in between. But the soldier press is much more on the side of this virulent racism, and they are, let me give you a quote here, and towards African Americans as well. The Manila Freedom is advocating for Chinese labor because they say, we're here supposedly to help the Filipino climb up the ladder of success. We have seen their shortcomings so often that we have rather grown to despise the little brown man with his timid ways. The Filipino is a Malay and will never get over that crowning misfortune. So this is kind of the typical notion of Orientalism, or the indolent Malay. This stuff is all over the soldier press, so much so that it's a thorn in the side of the US occupation. As scholars, we often see white racism as driving empire and having this outward push. But there's also an isolationist impulse to white racism, and I'm hopeful that with the Trump administration, scholars will think again about, there's a real push and pull, and white supremacy has this isolationist impulses, and what was I going to say? You can sort of see this in the soldier press. I mean, they are there in Manila, but that's what I was going to say. So the main occupation is the commission government in the Philippines after the war is engaged in Filipinization, that is, appointing Filipinos to government positions. So it's a more paternalistic kind of control. And the Lions of Manila, which is, I'll talk about Taft, Commissioner Taft, later to become president of the US, dubs the soldier press the Lions of Manila. He, the Filipino, the military press, the Lions are a thorn in his side, because they don't support Filipinization at all. They believe strongly in the racial inferiority of Filipinos. And so you can get too much, I guess, too much racism can work at odds to the US project in the Philippines. So Taft called them the young lions of the American press in Manila in a 1903 speech at Union Reading College in Manila. He said that the guerrilla war meant that the cruel guerrilla war meant that most of the soldier press still hated the Filipino, and quote, the Anglo-Saxon is not noted for his consideration for races which he considers inferior to his. And he goes on to describe the economics of this soldier press. He says, with 70,000 troops in the Philippines during the war, press profits from advertising, and a lot of it is beer advertising, were sound, but with reduced troop levels, he's talking in 1903, American weeklies in Manila were realizing they should have established more ties with Filipinos. The pinch is being felt, Taft says, and the Lions were responding defensively by blaming the commission government and what Taft called its policy of encouraging the native as far as it could. So those are the Lions, and it's sort of a pet peeve of mine as white settler colonialism and manifest destiny and the white man's burden deservedly get a lot of press. Let's also remember a lot of ink in academia. Let's also remember that there are these isolationist impulses to supremacy. I know it may be a little bit peculiar to be saying that when talking about soldiers that are in Manila, but many of them are writing about how much they want to go back just as soon as their newspaper makes them money or things like that. And the discussion of whether to annex the Philippines or not in 1899, several scholars have found that race was used most adamantly by the anti-imperialists. That is, and not the pro-imperialist, racist arguments. The idea here was the US is different from Britain. There's a lot of American exceptionalism involved in this argument. The idea that the US Constitution must follow the US flag. So if we take the Philippines, we're not like Britain. We give our, when we make an empire, we give everybody citizenship rights. Oh no, that means Filipinos will be able to travel back to the US and corrupt our democracy with their innate inferiority. That's sort of the Southerners, frequently Southerners, racist, anti-imperialist argument is very common around this time as well. Going a little over where I wanted to, so I guess I'll just do the last part of the headline, which is maybe I'll skip the wild Catholics for now. Well, I'll just summarize. The wild Catholic editors are another sort of thorn in Taft's side. The Irish American press, which is big overlap and often went the same with the Catholic press, was very against war in the Philippines. Now, once it starts to happen, they sort of switch and they become very concerned with the desecration of churches in the Philippines. And there's a lot of press around that in these Irish weeklies. Once the war is over, they're convinced that the commission government is trying to do away with Catholic education in the Philippines. And they're all fired up about that. And after McKinley's death, Roosevelt kind of inherits the problem. And he quickly appoints more Catholics to the school board and the Sherman Commission in hopes of mitigating this. And he writes Secretary Root, Secretary of War, in 1902, saying, I should think that even the wildest Catholic editor, now that we've made these appointments of more Catholics on the Sherman Commission, ought to curb his or her fury against you or me, against you and me. So maybe, one question I could have for you all, and with all the experience that I know must be in the, not in the room exactly, must be online, is, in the chapter, I stress, these fault lines in American identity, religion being one of them, obviously race. And something I haven't had time to talk about is how African-American rights were often discussed in conjunction in the late 19th century and post-Civil War with Chinese American rights and Native American rights. And oftentimes one was used as a foil for the other. So, for example, African Americans would stress their Christianity. We're Christian compared to those pagan. Chinese, why are they riding on streetcars where we're given, with whites, where we're given a segregated car? But these sorts of things come up a lot, and religion and race then get worked in together. But anyway, I call all these things fault lines, in the fault lines of American identity, and following the US abroad. And I don't want to overplay it because it didn't stop the US from waging a very brutal war and holding on to the Philippines for decades. So one question I have is how do we gauge this? How do we talk about the messiness of empire? How do we talk about sort of some of these problems without overplaying or underplaying them? And I talked a little bit about the isolationist impulses of white supremacist thought. Even as late as, is it 59 when Hawaiian statehood happens? People like Strom Thurmond, racist congressmen, are arguing, some of them even arguing for Hawaiian independence, taking a stand that seemingly would be radical, but it's again this idea of not wanting to incorporate this sort of mongrel nation of Hawaii, or mongrel territory. So I will, sorry this has been a little scattered, but I'll sort of stop there to hear more about you and your questions, and maybe turn it back over to Fernie to get us going. So thanks very much.
Thank you for that lecture, Brian. So the floor is now open for your questions. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, or if you'd prefer to speak, you can raise your hand. Just press the raise hand button and I'll be very happy to accommodate you. So let me kickstart the open forum with a question. Okay, well, actually, I'm very curious about your statement on the racialized discourse of civilization. And there were two aspects that you also talked about, and that's race and civility. Okay, so you mentioned a statement in a newspaper of the Bushmen of today not being capable of becoming the legislators of tomorrow. So uh, was it assumed that the lack of civility came with the race, or were these two separate factors, okay, that somehow found their way, being intertwined?
Fernie, I'm gonna, you're really breaking up for me.
Oh, sorry.
So maybe you could ask that again. Was it assumed?
Was it assumed that um, race and the lack of civility came together, or were race and the primitiveness, did they just so happen to intertwine? Did you hear me?
Were you able to? I'm having trouble. I hope it's not my connection. I heard that, was it assumed that race? Oh, was it assumed that race and lack of civility sort of went together? That is, different races would not get along together. Was that an assumption? Is that what you're asking? Or
Well, yes. Or was it just simply that the lack of civility and race just happened to intertwine? Or was there an assumption that because of the race, the people were uncivilized?
oh, I see. It feels like these arguments get used depending on what the person wants to say. So I do think there's the general notion that sometimes you can't tell. Some of the soldier diaries will talk about the great potential that Filipinos have if only the Spanish hadn't been keeping them down so much. Others make it sound, and so that makes it sound like that Spain had inflicted upon Filipinos a bad culture, but it's a culture that can change. Other commentators, it does sound like just a straight up belief in race science. This is a kind of a heightened time for race science. We're moving towards eugenics, heightened time for eugenics as well. So it sort of runs the gamut, I think. I hope that, from what I heard of your question, I hope that that answers some of it.
Mhm. So you also mentioned that many of the anti-imperialists were actually racists,
Mm.
and but in a lot of the literature, they are regarded as well, friends of Philippine independence later on, because they were among the groups who supported our independence, and maybe the context is as you explained. Now, among these anti-imperialists were people like Samuel Clemens, okay, and some industrialists, and well, there's a tendency to
Mhm.
generalize on their particular views. But how
Right.
diverse were these anti-imperialists?
Yeah. There was certainly, Mark Twain and the Anti-Imperialist League had a fair amount of support. So I don't mean to characterize all anti-imperialist arguments as racist. It was a strain of many Southerners, as you say. Um, and then there was Twain and his group. So there was there were coalitions of convenience sometimes uh, in order to try to prevent the annexation. There could be sort of strange bedfellows to some extent. Yeah.
Okay. Now, earlier you also mentioned that in one of the newspapers, the Filipino as being Malay was stated as a misfortune. Okay, so the Filipino Malayness is a misfortune. I mean, how was Malayness defined at this time? Was it purely racial, or was it because of the cultural affinity with the Malay world? I mean, of Filipinos.
Mm-hmm. Um, the, Many commentators were very confused. Uh, um, and again, you get, I mean, I've seen what certainly looks like a lot of race science, racist and race science. But there are probably they're mixed in there, some critiques of the Malay that might be thinking more in terms of culture. Um, there's a guy named Jenks, Jenks, who's uh, uh, the Chinese are often compared um, to uh, uh, Filipinos and others in Southeast Asia, and seen as having a more entrepreneurial spirit and involved in. Let me exit out of. Okay. So again, I mean, I think it's a good criticism. Occasionally, some of these commentators may be talking about culture, something that can be changed, not something essential. But I know there is a lot of commentary on the Malay race, and sometimes and negative commentary, and sometimes it's seen as almost too much of a mix. And weirdly and contradictory, with real contradiction, you sometimes hear the exact opposite, that Malays need rejuvenation of blood and could use some racial mixing, something. And it's almost as if racism doesn't make much sense and people are just using certain arguments to make whatever argument they want to make, that support their position.
Okay. All right. We have a question in the chat box from Ms. Gemma Araneta. Mr. Shott, did the U.S. government deliberately make the Spaniards look bad?
The U.S. government deliberately make the Spaniards look bad. Um, I mean, I would say yes. You get this strange, and again, you get this strange. They're certainly seen as part of the white family, if we're talking about this sort of racist vision. At the same time, the Spanish, what is considered American, normative American, really is kind of an Anglo-Saxon Protestant vision. Some of the commentary on Catholicism coming from Protestant missionaries, and this is something Taft has to keep backtracking and make apologies for. The Spanish are going to be seen as Catholic, and the Philippines is the Catholic Church's kind of outpost. Plus, Filipinos seem to the Americans to be very upset with the friars. In fact, early missionaries to the Philippines mistake anger at the friars for readiness for conversion. Some Protestants really convinced themselves that Filipinos are ready to give up Catholicism just because they're so angry at the friars. So you get this notion that the U.S. Is convinced of Spanish brutality in Cuba, and then it sort of speaks of the Philippines as just this neglected outpost where Spain kind of gave Filipinos all their own bad habits, taxed Filipinos far too much, never gave them a chance. At the same time, many historians think the Battle of Manila was a little bit staged, and that Spain had already sort of said, we're going to surrender, and we don't want a bloody battle, so let's just fire off some weapons for a little bit, and then we'll surrender. So they're both working together, and at the same time, yes, the U.S. is deliberately trying to make Spain look bad, and a lot of this is coming after the so-called yellow press is really playing up sometimes real Spanish atrocities in Cuba, in order to get the U.S. to go to war in Cuba at the beginning of the Spanish-American War.
All right. Can you hear me? I think our speaker was disconnected, so let's just wait for a moment for him to reconnect. Can you hear me, Brian? Okay.
Can you hear me, Fernie?
Yeah, I can see you and I can hear you. Yes.
We're back.
We're back, yes.
Okay.
So just a follow-up statement from Ms. Gemma Araneta. So it is true that the U.S. was responsible for the Leyenda Negra, or the Black Legend. Okay, now the next question comes from Ms. Laura Diaz Esteve. And well, the question is related to an earlier question and to your comment on how the civil rights struggles from the different ethnic groups in the US could be related. So her question is, I wondered if you have any clue on how the other Asian communities, the Chinese or Japanese immigrants, for example, in the US, reacted to the imperialist depictions of Filipinos as uncivilized.
So I heard the last part of that. Is there any way that you could cut and paste that into the chat?
Oh, okay, I'll do that.
I only heard the very last part. Oh, okay, I see it. Thank you. Civil rights struggle, Asian communities reacted. That's a great question. I've looked a little bit at a student group of Filipinos in at Berkeley, California. They had their own publication. And you know, they're fighting these depictions of Filipinos as uncivilized. I'm trying to think about how, if I know anything about how the Japanese or Chinese were reacting. It's a very good question, because especially if you're familiar with some of these political cartoons, they can either draw Filipinos in the racist way of minstrelsy, that is with the comical, as sort of drawn as the racist stereotype of African Americans, kinky hair, oversized lips, et cetera, or that some cartoonists choose to depict Filipinos as more like racist depictions of Native Americans, feathers, and a more of a tribal kind of thing. And I'm just blanking right now on maybe because I haven't looked at so much of the Chinese and Japanese press is in language. I haven't gone to that source because I don't read Chinese. Yeah, I'm going to have.
It seems we're having connectivity problems again. So let's just. Oh, there you are. Nice to see you. Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, I'm not sure on, I can't think of any specific examples on, at least on the Chinese and Japanese, on their pushing back. I know the Filipino students were very concerned with their image and being upright and trying to lobby the president of Berkeley, in this case, Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, who was connected to the US government in various ways. They were working hard to try to improve relations between the US and the Philippines. So.
Yeah, that's one thing that should be considered about Philippine society. We have a society that gives an impression that it's one of, extremes. On one hand, you have those, we do have people as they are depicted as, as Bushmen, primitive types. While at the same time, we also have individuals or groups who are highly, or back then, highly Europeanized, difficult to distinguish from the Spaniards in their manner of dress or even their manner of speaking. Okay, but of course they were the minority and more of the exception rather than the rule. And yeah, I was also curious if there was any indication of uh, familiarity with that kind of Filipino type in the Black press or the African American
Mm,
press.
mm. I I don't recall reference to, say, the Illustrados or I mean, I think when I think of T. Thomas Fortune and his accounts of his travels, um, he does uh, he he seems to sort of seems like he's trying to judge people on on their behavior and maybe not their class positions. So he will sometimes talk about what a intelligent, respectable Filipino he had dinner with, or something like that. But then at one point in his travels in Luzon, he is let into the mansion of a very wealthy Filipino, and Fortune is convinced that the guy is on opium and high, and so he sort of seems to try. Fortune tries to call it as he sees it. He talks about his hopes for a new community of the what he calls the best Filipinos, um, the uh, the best um, the best Europeans and white people, and I think he says something like most African Americans in the Philippines, and this could create this cosmopolitan mix, could really bring the Philippines forward if it wasn't for all these white Southerners who are, he felt, reproducing Southern more as Jim Crow type segregation, Southern racism in Manila. He really felt like a lot of positions in the commission hierarchy or in the Philippine, the American kind of constables and police were going to Southerners. Fortune grew up in Florida when he was young, and so he felt like he could sense the same kind of Southern feel to Manila because of all these damn U.S. Southerners in Manila. So he did sometimes recognize what he called sort of the better breed or the better class of Filipinos, and imagined a cosmopolitan mix that would really bring the Philippines forward.
Yes, because there is that perception of extremes, which leads to another perception of some kind of contradiction in the perception of Filipinos. But at the same time, there are actually many shades of gray in between. So, and in fact, at least from my knowledge of history, the American forces encountered more, the middle class types or the man on the street. Can you hear me? We lost the connection again. Can you hear me, Brian?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah. So as I was saying, the portrayal of Filipinos can be of the extremes to the point of, you know, uh, uh, showing some kind of contradiction. So on one hand, one can be a Filipino like Jose Rizal, who is highly westernized, and in some cartoons I've seen, Filipinos are wearing skirts, grass skirts even, and looking very primitive. But yet, the kind of Filipinos encountered by many of the troops who went to the Philippines were more of the typical middle class types. Not really the poorest of the poor or the wealthiest of the rich, but these are the regular people on the streets. And I wonder if such experience somehow affected their, how they perceived the nation or even the race in general. I mean, was there any progression on the perception throughout the duration of the Philippine-American War?
I do think something happens in, there's been a lot of scholarship on World's Fairs. And around this time, World's Fairs often had, because the United States had now annexed the Philippines, they would have a Philippines section. And this could again go straight to the extremes in some ways. And you would have representatives from tribal peoples, and the press would, in the Philippines, and the press would talk about the dog eaters, come see the dog eaters, or this or that. But at the same time, I know in St. Louis, I think it was the 1904 St. Louis Fair, many Filipinos came to the fair along with either along with white residents of the Philippines, or met white people there. I guess what I'm trying to say is the press got the St. Louis press got very upset with Filipinos. I think they were Filipino either police officers or somehow in the commission government, walking with white women at this fair. And what had happened was racial mores were relaxing more in the Philippines. There was some progress being made, at least compared to St. Louis, which is kind of southern in a certain sense, or was even more so, I think, back then. And so a sort of mainstream racist white press is, what are all these Filipinos doing walking around with, our white women? Whereas on the streets of Manila, you had much more interaction, casual interaction, not to mention occasional intermarriage or whatever actual relationships, had become much more accepted. So that's a case, I do believe, where something that had developed, new racial, more relaxed racial and egalitarian racial mores were developing in the metropole, that in the colony, that the metropole couldn't, at least part of the St. Louis couldn't abide by. This became a controversy at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. So it's not, I've given a very sort of negative view. It's not all bad in Manila, and that's one of the hard things to talk about is sort of, you don't want to do a balance sheet of empire and say that, well, the British built railroads in India, right? We want to, they were building railroads to help them extract the wealth, but you do want to present a fair picture of the US in the Philippines and in Manila after this brutal war. And yeah, it can be hard to do sometimes when you start looking for the bad stuff and studying race and by extension racism. But there are more positive mores developing for some people in the Philippines at this time as well.
Okay. We had a raised hand from Mr. Alejandro Soriano. Mr. Soriano, would you still like to ask your question? Yeah, it's raining outside, and I think we're having connectivity issues. Well, unfortunately, it's also just about
maybe
maybe
the chat might work, and if you will hear me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time. I mean, it's all that our time permits. I understand that you're coming up or you're coming out with a publication I mean, sometime soon. Can you please tell us more about it?
Sure. I actually went to the, oops, I can show you the cover of the book. It's now online. So let me share my screen. So this is the book. It's from Amsterdam University Press. And much of what I talked about is I have a chapter in this book. It's Farish A. Noor.
Sorry, we lost you for a moment. Yeah, but you're back.
I'm back. Okay. Let me try one more time. I have a chapter in this upcoming book, be released in January. And Farish is a professor at NTU. Peter Carey is a well-known scholar of Indonesia. And I think there are about 7 or 8 chapters. Looks like January 15th coming out. 99 euros. Maybe you can get your institution to buy it for you, or find some way to find it at an academic library. Looking at wars in Southeast Asia and how race is involved in those wars from pretty much 1800 to, again, the very beginnings of the 19th century, 20th century. So.
Okay. So on behalf of oh yeah, please go ahead.
Oh no, my own book, Mediating America, was released last year, 2019. So that's, especially if you're more interested in, I didn't talk much about religion as much as I could have, but there's a lot about Irish American press and Catholicism in that book as well. So, but I really want to thank everybody for, sounds like we held the same number of participants pretty much the whole time. I hope you could hear me most of the time, and really appreciate taking the time on this rainy afternoon.
All right. So on behalf of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, I'd like to thank Dr. Brian Shott for sharing his time and expertise with us through this webinar. And to our participants, thank you for joining us. And it's been a pleasure being with you all today. Thank you.